Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, Episode 7. I am the show's host, Kyle, and before we get into the foreign policy news, I just have a few quick messages for the listeners. The first message is that if you haven't already, please leave me a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. It would help the show to grow, help the show to reach new listeners, and make the show appealing to people who may be scrolling through on iTunes and looking for something new to read. You see a 5 stars and a few reviews next to the show, you might be more willing to click on it. The second message I have for the audience is that if you like this show and you like talking about foreign policy, you should check out the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. It's a group I started for people who like the show or for people who like to talk about foreign policy from, a non-interventionist perspective. I suggest everybody go to their Facebook search bar, type in Foreign Policy Focus, request to join, I'll get you approved. We have a few discussions about some Middle East stuff going on and what may or may not be happening as a result of all the intervention and wars, and so it could be a fun place to talk to some other people who are interested in this if you are. So I suggest going to that. Like I said, Facebook search bar, Foreign Policy Focus, and I'll get you approved. Moving into the foreign policy news, we'll start with Somalia. The Pentagon gave its report to Donald Trump on what the U.S. policy should be in Somalia going forward. The U.S. has been involved in Somalia since the early 1990s. It started with George H.W. Bush having a food program there. We have Bill Clinton getting a little bit more interventionist in Somalia, with the pinnacle of this being the Black Hawk Down incident. Most Americans are probably familiar with this from the movie that came out detailing kind of what happened, where a U.S. helicopter gets shot down, and it was really a debacle. The whole thing went so poorly that Bill Clinton actually withdrew from Somalia and really let the country just do its own thing for a few years. This went on from about 1993 to 2000. This is a period of time where Somalia didn't have a government, and for you libertarians out there, you'll know that this is the time all the liberals say, oh, if you don't like having a government, why don't you move to Somalia? If you've heard that, this is where it comes from. One important thing to note is that while Somalia has never been a successful or peaceful state, the most successful and peaceful that Somalia has been was under this period where there wasn't a formal government. And while there were some bad things going on in the country at this time, it by no means was the same as when the U.S. was supporting warlords or sending in its troops and helicopters and drone bombs. So we get to 2000 and the U.S. decides it needs to get involved in Somalia again. We try to put in a unity government or a transition government in place. However, the government doesn't have any real power. Then we have 9/11 happen. George Bush exploits 9/11 to get the U.S. more involved in Somalia. We do this by propping up warlords and carrying out targeted attacks and assassinations and kidnappings in the country. This eventually leads to the point where we have Ethiopia under U.S. guidance invading the country, and the Islamic Courts Union forming by 13 Somalian groups to resist this invasion. The Ethiopians kill off most of the Islamic Courts Union except for a group known as Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is now labeled a terrorist group and has since pledged its allegiance to Al-Qaeda, but at that time they had not. Al-Shabaab eventually drives the invading militaries out of the country, and you get to the point where now you have kind of a government in Somalia, but Al-Shabaab controls a lot of area, and it's generally been a disaster. Also around 2010, you have the drought and famine in Somalia. While the drought would have been bad and would have led to probably some starvation no matter what, with all the war going on and all the U.S. intervention and rallying other countries to get involved in Somalia, the drought turns into a famine where you have 250,000 people die, with about half of those people dead being children. And now the U.S. or the Pentagon has recommended that the U.S. policy towards Somalia be increasing the number of airstrikes we have in Somalia, and doing this by loosening the restrictions that the U.S. currently places on the Army for having airstrikes in the region. They also want to increase the special forces presence in the country by putting special forces closer to the front lines, and they would like to increase the amount of money that we give to the Somali military. All these actions will really not help what's going on in Somalia, and will only create more hostility and animosity towards the United States. As we've seen from all the history that I've detailed, of the U.S. intervention in Somalia over the past 25 years or so, that every time the U.S. has gotten involved, that the situation has become worse. And the only time the situation really got better in Somalia was a few years that America wasn't involved. The airstrikes will lead to more anti-American hostility out of the Somalians. Of course, anytime you loosen the restrictions on the airstrikes that could take place, this usually means that either the airstrikes are allowed to happen where in an area where there's a higher probability of civilian death or a lower likelihood that the target's actually in the area. So sometimes we're carrying out bombings and we don't actually know who's in the area, but we think somebody's in the area and we're then able to carry out a drone strike or a targeted airstrike. However, in some countries we have restrictions on if we're allowed to do this at the time, or even if we know that the person's in the area, there may be a lot of civilians around, and so we hold off carrying out that strike. However, in some countries we have very loose restrictions on this, mean that we could carry out a strike even if there's a lot of civilians around, or a lot of civilians may die, or we're not exactly sure that the person's there but we think they might be there, and so we go ahead and carry out the airstrike. As you can imagine, the looser these restrictions are, the more civilians that tend to die and the more anti-American sentiment that's created in these countries. Putting the special forces closer to the front lines will probably just lead to a few more Americans being killed by fighting in Somalia. So the closer they are to the front lines, the more likely they'll get shot or suicide bombed. Or the danger here is that the American government will really use these deaths to rally more American support for more war in Somalia. So many of our troops have been killed in Somalia, so now we need more airstrikes in the area, and this will rally the U.S. population to more likely support this policy. Moving on to Iraq, we have the invasion of Mosul, western Mosul going on. East Mosul has already been taken. So the Iraqi government has taken Mosul airport and rolled through some of the villages on the outskirts of the south of West Mosul. Now they are getting to the more urban fighting and moving out of the countryside and into the city, and as this happened, just like what happened in East Mosul, that the progress of the Iraqi army has pretty much come to a halt. We're now getting to the point where ISIS is going to be using a lot of suicide car bombs and snipers to really hold back the Iraqi military from making advances. There's also a lot of reports that ISIS fighters using drones to drive back the Iraqi army. Once again, U.S. troops are embedded pretty close to the front line, so when you have suicide car bombs coming and, driving into the Iraqi forces and detonating, we do have more of a risk of U.S. deaths coming out of this fighting. And if we see more U.S. deaths, we may see more airstrikes on the city, because that may be the U.S.'s government way to kind of balance out our troops dying and try to increase the invasion of Mosul to go a little faster, is if we have more airstrikes on ISIS target. However, a lot of times in the city you have a situation where ISIS may be on the 5th floor of a building, but floors 1 through 4 are occupied by civilians, and so if you do carry out that airstrike, you're going to kill a lot of civilians, and you have a lot of risk of making matters worse in that way. The people of Mosul don't seem to feel a whole lot of allegiance to the Iraqi government in Baghdad, so if you have a situation where the people of Mosul are liberated by the Iraqi army, but that comes at a lot of deaths of citizens of Mosul, you may have them resisting the occupation of the Iraqi and U.S. forces as well. And so that's definitely something to be concerned about and to keep our eyes on as we move forward. And we have to be careful and make sure that as we're ridding Mosul of ISIS, we don't create more enemies for ourselves in the process. So far, the fighting in Mosul has led to 4,000 displaced residents. Those residents are living in refugee camps outside of the city. There's a lot of concern about there being so many refugees from western Mosul that we have a situation where the Iraqi government can't handle the number of refugees, and we see some starvation or people freezing to death in the refugee camps. So it'll be something to keep watch on, and think about it if you're looking to be charitable. I'm sure these refugee camps could use some additional aid, and going online and looking for maybe ways to donate or help these people out would be great. We also have the Iraqi government retaliating against ISIS for some car bombs that went off in Baghdad by bombing ISIS targets in Syria. The ISIS targets in Syria were apparently right on the Syrian and Iraqi border, and it may also be somewhat of a tactical move to keep ISIS and fighters and supplies from moving across the border. However, this is a situation now where we have one more country bombing in Syria. This is at least 5 different groups, I believe, now bombing in Syria. We have the U.S. coalition, the Iraqi government, the Syrian government, the Russian government, and Turkey has been flying some missions inside of Syria, as well as Israel actually has bombed a few times around Damascus, claiming that they're stopping weapon shipments from going to Hezbollah. So yes, lots of groups bombing in Syria, and it only makes this more and more dangerous. The more people you have bombing, the more risk you have of maybe a U.S. fighter plane and a Russian fighter plane coming into contact, and then hopefully not an international incident. But it's always a possibility, and you don't want to see anything like that happening. You also have troops from several different countries on the ground, U.S. Special Forces, Syrian troops, Turkish troops. I don't know how many Russian troops are on the ground in Syria, or if there's any Israeli troops on the ground in Syria right now. But anytime you have the troops and the different fighter planes flying around, you risk having, let's say, a Russian plane bomb some U.S. Special Forces troops, which would certainly be an international disaster. And so with so many groups operating in Syria, it's always a concern. The last story coming out of Iraq that's important is the Kurds are looking to maybe create their own independent state from Iraq. Kurdish fighters have taken a lot of land outside of the region that's somewhat known as Kurdistan. This is the more heavily Kurdish regions where Kurdish populations are the majority. However, ISIS had taken a lot of areas surrounding Kurdistan, and so the Kurds went out and rid ISIS of those areas, and so a lot of these lands are maybe majority Sunni populations, and now the Kurdish forces control those. The Iraqi Kurds had said that they are willing to trade those lands to the Iraqi government for independence. It'll be really interesting to see what comes of this story. We were actually having a pretty good discussion of it in the Facebook group earlier. There's a lot of possibilities of what could happen. I guess the Iraqi government could say, no to the Kurds, and we're not going to negotiate with you. Give us our lands back, or we'll take them by force, and you're still going to be ruled by Baghdad. We could continue to have this status quo situation, whereas the Iraqi Kurds pretty much operate independently, but are still territorially a part of the Iraqi state, and are in some ways still owe allegiance to the Iraqi government. If the Kurds are granted some kind of autonomy, or more autonomy by the Iraqi government, then we could have other regional powers being upset with this. There are several places around the Middle East where there are groups who are a majority in big parts of land areas, but don't necessarily have a lot of representation from the government. So we could look at either the Syrian Kurds as a group, the Syrian Sunnis, or the Shiites in Saudi Arabia, the Houthis in Yemen. These are all groups who have significant territory in the countries they're operating in. However, they don't have their independent state and are ruled over by a government that doesn't necessarily reflect their values. And so, if you start granting these countries autonomy, states like Turkey or Syria or Saudi Arabia may become pretty upset because they could see it as maybe a signal to their minority populations to rise up and look for their own independence as well. Now we'll move on to Syria. News coming out of Syria is that Nikki Haley is at the UN pushing for new sanctions against the Syrian government. The new sanctions, Nikki Haley says, are because Assad is using chemical weapons in Syria. When I first read this story, I thought it must be from 2011, and a reporter mistakenly put Nikki Haley's name in this story instead of Samantha Power. We all know that Obama had famously drew his red line for Syria, saying that if Assad used chemical weapons, he would get involved in the conflict. However, there was a false flag attack, and Assad was blamed for having used chemical weapons. However, it was actually the Syrian rebels who used the weapons, but this didn't get to the U.S. media in time, and the narrative in the U.S. is still widely known that, or thought of, that Assad used the chemical weapons. But what happened was that Putin kind of bailed Obama out because the American people didn't want war in Syria anyways, and said, I'll make sure that Assad loses all of his chemical weapons. And there's a pretty well documented paper trail that Assad gave all of his chemical weapons to Putin to destroy. And so now Nikki Haley is claiming that Assad's using chemical weapons again. I haven't seen any proof that this would be happening, and it seems much more likely that the rebels are once again trying to provoke a false flag and get the U.S. involved more on their side, as we see Trump kind of pulling more support from the Syrian rebels. A chemical attack may be a way to redraw the U.S. in and do some more invading in Syria, which the rebels would certainly like to see, since they are losing, and the U.S. would target Assad if they are able to push the narrative that Assad's using chemical weapons. The second story I have coming out of Syria is that there was a pretty large suicide bombing in the country that led to the death of over 70 people. The bombing was in the town of Al-Bab that had just been taken from ISIS by the Turkish troops. The suicide bomb was set off by ISIS, and just goes to show how difficult it's going to be moving forward in Iraq and Syria. Even as they're able to liberate these towns from ISIS, it doesn't mean ISIS is gone from the towns. They're just turning from an army into an insurgency. The insurgency is going to be just as dangerous, because they'll be able to carry out these kinds of attacks and other attacks against the civilian and military populations of those cities. I believe ISIS targeted the Free Syrian Army, who are currently backed by the Kurdish forces, with this attack. Moving around the east to Afghanistan, we have 10 members of the Afghani police force and the wife of the police commissioner, all killed by ISIS in the northern part of Afghanistan. This is one of the first attacks carried out by ISIS in Afghanistan, the northern part of the country. For the most part, they've been located in the east of the country, mostly in the Nangarhar province. And we've discussed in the past how the the Iraqi government, backed with the U.S., is looking to move in and eliminate ISIS from that province. However, with the move of ISIS to the north, we're seeing that they're really not going to be able to make much progress against ISIS in the country, and it seems like ISIS is spreading in the country. Again, we're seeing the more the U.S. tries to stomp out these groups, the more they spread and cause more havoc for the countries that we're trying to get rid of them in. Quick news note on Iran, and that is that a UN watchdog group says that that Iran continues to follow the nuclear deal made with the US and 5 other countries. Iran is well below the amount of nuclear waste they were allowed to have in the country, and while we often see reports that, Iran is pushing up against their limits on the deal, a lot of times it's just the schedule of when the waste is allowed to leave the country, because it's not easy to get rid of the nuclear waste all the time. There may not be countries that are willing to take it at that exact moment, and so that sometimes causes Iran issues pushing up against the limit of what they're allowed to have. However, the watchdog group says that Iran is now well below the limit they're allowed to have. We have some news coming out of North Korea and regarding the U.S. as well, and that is that the Trump administration is not allowing a North Korean delegation to have visas to enter the United States. There was a plan for this delegation to meet with some former U.S. officials to just, kind of discuss baseline thoughts about maybe what the North Koreans would want from a deal with the U.S., what the U.S. would want from the North Koreans in a deal, and then the U.S. portion of the meeting was going to go back and let Trump know what happened. The Trump administration pulled those visas, so the meeting is not going to happen. Some speculate that the reason the visas got pulled was that the Malaysian government said that a nerve agent was used to kill Kim Jong-un's brother. It's believed that the North Korean government carried out the assassination of Kim Jong-un, and so I guess that was enough of a disturbing story for the Trump administration to decide not to allow the North Koreans to come to the U.S. I think talks are always better than not having talks, so once again, I think this is a situation where the U.S. maybe could have found a third country to meet in, or just allow the Koreans to come and meet with the U.S. officials. I think it's pretty unlikely that the Korean delegation would have tried to kill any U.S. members, and maybe limiting the amount of places the North Koreans could go really could have allowed this meeting to happen and form some kind of baseline communications between the two countries that's desperately needed. A humanitarian update on what's happening in Yemen. In Yemen, 7.3 million people are on the brink of starvation, and 500,000 children are severely malnourished. This situation in Yemen continues to get worse as the Saudis are bombing one of the main entry points for aid in the north of Yemen. It's a port where aid ships are able to dock and offload food, aid, and other medical supply cargo. However, the Saudis have bombed the port, and most of the cranes have been destroyed, and so it's pretty hard for aid to get in. Also, a lot of aid ships aren't going to dock in the area if there's a risk of being attacked. So if Saudi Arabia is currently carrying out attacks in the area, you may have the aid ships not be willing to go there. Like I said, with all the people starving in Yemen, we're really putting the country on the brink of famine by supporting the Saudi campaign and bombing the country. This is once again a campaign that could be stopped by the Trump administration. Now, at any time, simply by saying we're not going to support the Saudi government anymore. Saudi Arabia would still have maybe some limited capabilities to carry out strikes in Yemen, but like I said, they would be severely limited and probably wouldn't carry out war much longer in Yemen without the U.S. assistance. We're providing targeting assistance, we're providing weapons to the Saudis, we're providing mid-air refueling to the Saudis, and all this assistance is really what allows Saudi Arabia to carry out this war. Alright, I'd like to conclude this show today by talking about a news story that came forward about the father of the soldier who was killed in the U.S. raid in Yemen. The story that the media is focusing on is that the father of the soldier said that he didn't want to meet with Donald Trump when his son's body arrived home from overseas. I guess he was pretty upset with Donald Trump at the time and still is. And one of the comments he made is that he didn't understand why his son had to be on the ground in Yemen and why the U.S. could continue to carry out either missile strikes or drone strikes in the country, and why there was a boots on the ground kind of raid. He says he doesn't understand why his son's life was worth being... He said he didn't understand why his son's life was being worth put on the line for what's going on in Yemen. I think this quote is pretty reflective of the way the Americans are starting to maybe look at some of our overseas policies, that we're saying, well, it's not worth U.S. lives to be involved in these countries. We don't want to lose any more troops over there. But at the same time, we still want to be involved and risk other people's lives for being over there. And I think Americans need to come to realize that if it's not worth our lives, then it's not worth the lives of the other people that we're bombing as well. What this man was able to understand is that it was stupid for his son to go over there and die, and that his son didn't need to die. But what he doesn't understand is that it was terrible that all the children in that raid died as well. And if we had just dropped a bomb over there, nobody in America would be outcrying that it wasn't worth the lives of these 10 children or so that were killed in that raid. But that's something that we need to consider as well, is that the lives of other people matter just as much as the lives of America. Everybody's a person. It doesn't matter if you're an American or a Yemeni. And it's completely senseless to continue to kill people in these missions that lead to absolutely no progress being made in any of these countries. None of these countries are getting safer or better or spreading democracy like Bush promised. This isn't what's happening, and it's not the humanitarian intervention that Obama promised either. If we look at what happened in Libya was a much safer and better country before we killed Gaddafi. Now the country's in chaos with multiple governments and ISIS controlling regions of the country. If we look at Iraq and Syria, largely the same situation, where the U.S. got involved in prolonging conflicts and creating conflicts where they didn't start in the first place. And more America and Americans are suggesting that we continue to carry out these bombing raids to quote-unquote get the bad guys, but anytime we're trying to get the bad guys, we're ending up killing innocent civilians as well. These innocent civilians include children, and when it's an American citizen, when it's an American who dies, American people understand very well that the life of that man was not worth the mission that he went on. But when it's the lives of people of another country, suddenly we fail to recognize that those lives matter a lot. They matter to the people that are there. They matter to their family members. They matter to their countrymen. And just as upset as Americans get when an American dies, the people of Yemen or the people of Iraq or the people of Syria get just as equally upset when a person in their country dies. Dies for what is pretty much no reason at all. There's no reason to be carrying out these strikes. They're not accomplishing anything. Looking at Americans' foreign policy in the last 25 years absolutely proves that. And so what we need to do as Americans is expand our thinking, like how the father feels about his son. Just expand that to everybody around the globe and realize that the more we intervene, the worse things are going to get and the more people that we're going to upset. And that when you look at this situation from a moral issue, it's nasty. What we're doing is terrible, and we're killing people for absolutely no reason. And all this put together really shows that Americans' foreign policy is a complete and utter failure and needs to end. And hopefully one day the father of that soldier could look at the people of Yemen like he looks at his own son and realize that the conflict over there, the bombings, the raids, they're all just leading to wasted life. Alright, with that, I'm going to wrap up the show today. For those of you who like the show, maybe want to listen to past episodes, I either suggest subscribing to the show on iTunes or going to foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. You could go to my website, kylesfilesblog.com. I put out a daily news roundup so you could keep up to date on all the foreign policy news and all the other news that I think is important that I don't talk about in this podcast. You could read me on the libertarianinstitute.org, or you could go to my Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. Thanks everybody for listening, and I will be back on Wednesday.